The cavalry, a force that has always been decisive in the history of man. From the domestication of the horse to today's tanks, when, why, and how has the cavalry changed so much? What are the origins of cavalry? As early as 3000 BC, the horse was hunted for meat. In 5000 BC, the horse was already domesticated in Central Europe, but it was not traded on. Instead, people used it for milk and meat, just like cows. Between 4000 BC and 3000 BC, in Mesopotamia, people started using the horse more wisely. The horse was used for transportation and even in wars, although it was not considered a cavalry unit yet. Both the Sumerians and the Hittites used horses in their wars, but it was not considered a cavalry unit because there were only individuals fighting on horses, not actual units of mounted men. In 860 BC came the big change. The cavalry was invented by the Assyrians. The Assyrians used bows and arrows to fight, and were the first ones to use saddles. In fact, they invented the saddle, which was an important invention since it gave the cavalryman more stability on the horse. This is where the cavalry could be found by 860 BC.
There were two main advantages in cavalry, and one is the fear factor. Fear factor actually decides the situation of the battle. If you see the infantry line sees horsemen running towards you, then you just freak out and drop your weapon and you just want to get out of the situation. And that's the fear factor. And secondly, mobility. If man is just running with his feet, it's not as fast as a man on the horse, which can just go right behind you and slap your neck and slash it off. So mobility is really important advantage of cavalry, and it still has the legacy as the helicopter.
We are afraid of the man on the four-legged beast.
After the Assyrians, the cavalry was spread throughout the Fertile Crescent and even got to Egypt. As the time went by, cavalry tactics started to appear. The first well-known cavalry tactic was the oblique phalanx of the Thebans, which was used for perhaps the first time in 371 BC in the war between the Thebans and the Spartans.
The oblique phalanx consists of a cavalry unit attacking a small portion of the enemy army, then coming back only to attack again. Speed was a major component in this, which ensured the cavalry's success.
Later on, Alexander the Great and his famous companion cavalry modified the Theban oblique phalanx to defeat the Persians. The cavalry, back then, had one major fault. The horses were not strong enough to carry the soldiers with armors on. That meant the cavalrymen were very vulnerable. This is when one of the greatest inventions in the history of cavalry was made. In 300 BC, the Parthians, through artificial selection, were able to create a breed of horses that was strong enough to carry a fully armored cavalryman. This type of cavalry was later called heavy cavalry. Another great invention that came much later, in 322 AD, was the stirrup, which was invented by the Chinese. This is where the cavalry could be found by 322 AD. The cavalry was brought to Europe through the Battle of Tours, which was fought between the Muslims and the Europeans. This is one of the only battles in history in which an infantry army, the Europeans, defeated a cavalry army, the Muslims. After defeating the Muslims, the Europeans started to use the cavalry themselves, as they saw the Muslims do. The cavalry in Europe was characterized by its heavy cavalry, in which even the horses were heavily armored. The cavalry in Europe stayed pretty much the same all along the medieval times. This is where the cavalry could be found by 732 AD. Then came Napoleon, who greatly contributed to the cavalry. He utilized the scouts a lot and started putting the cavalry behind his infantry.
The job of the scouts was to be sent out into the battlefield and then examine and explore for any enemies that are unknown yet. They could then come back and report to the general, who would prepare accordingly.
This is where the cavalry could be found by 1856 AD. In World War I, horse cavalry was used by all the armies that participated. There was only one army that had a different kind of cavalry, the British Army. They were the first ones to use tank cavalry when they invented the Mark I tank in 1916. Between World War I and World War II, more countries developed tanks. By the time World War II began, all the armies used tank cavalries instead of horse cavalries. The Polish army is the only army known to have used horse cavalry by that time. Today, horse cavalry is not used in wars anymore, but it is indeed used in ceremonies related to the army forces and in city patrols. The world has moved to tank cavalry, which, today, can be found all over the world. The cavalry was very important to our history. From horse to tank, the cavalry underwent many changes, and this idea of mobilization in the battlefield will last forever.